How was everyone today? Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. My job is to moderate this session. It's a session, obviously, about storytelling, about identities. We have three excellent speakers this afternoon. The first speaker is Erika Larsen is going to be the third speaker. She's a photojournalist whose work, I think, we live in a visual culture. So much of our world occurs visually. So I think that the work of photojournalists and photographers really shape even how we see and how we read. So Erika is going to be our third presenter. Our second presenter is Valentina Glockner. She's an anthropologist who does work on Mexico and the US-Mexico border. Our final presentation is going to be by Dominic Bracco, and he also is a photographer, and his work focuses on US-Mexico border relationships. And we know how much borders are in the media today. Borders shape how we think, where we think, how we travel. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations and to engaging in the conversation. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Dominic Bracco to come up to the stage. Hello.
Thank you. Thanks. Hey, everyone. Hope everybody's not too sleepy after lunch. I am. So I'm going to show you guys a body of work called My Republic, and I call it My Republic because it's a story about me. I grew up in South Texas, in an area that obviously right now is in the news all the time. I'm going to tell you guys a little story. So when I was 18, I went to go visit my great uncle in the hospital. And it was the kind of place where, they go and visit you 6 times because you're about to die, and changing bedpans and all these kinds of things and checking in with him. And on his deathbed, I was sitting with my cousin Herbie, and Mario told us this story about this revolutionary figure, Zapata, who was our relative. And of course, Herbie was like, "Oh man, we're related to Emiliano," and so he got this tattoo on his leg when Mario died, and said, "This better to live on your feet and die on your knees." It's a famous Emiliano Zapata quote. And this, of course, wasn't our relative. We were related to another guy who died in a different revolution for the República de Rio Grande, which was a border state basically between Texas, the South Texas, south of Corpus Christi, northern Tamaulipas, and Nuevo León. And he was killed. He was executed by Santa Anna's army. His head was stuck on a stake. It was like a very graphic sort of fronterizo thing, which we continue to see this type of violence, unfortunately. None of us even remembered, even his own relatives. Even though there's a county in Texas named after him, there's a city in Texas named after him. Actually, some of my family live in Zapata, Texas, and they don't even know this story. But my point of all of this is that I started to realize that there's a huge problem in the way that we look at the border because we don't understand its history. We don't understand how it was formed. We don't understand what that means. And it's all part of this big myth, a myth that the American West was open for the settlement of white families, and that Mexican immigration to the United States is unprecedented. My Uncle Mario was a coyote. So he was a human trafficker. He went to prison for human trafficking. And at the time on his deathbed, I really wanted to ask him about that. I wasn't yet a journalist. I was just beginning my career and starting to take pictures. But I didn't know how to ask him. And I was afraid, and I felt like I would offend him. And that was unfortunate, and I think very naive of me at the time. Because Mario was a product of his environment. Mario grew up on the border, and he was a gay man, and he suffered a lot from our family. They pushed him out. He had a hard time finding work and all these kinds of things. And of course, one thing that was available to him was being a bilingual American citizen who could cross back and forth freely. And that's basically the essence of what the border is and the habitants have done. And you look at the Apaches, the history of coyotes, you look at drug traffickers, all of these sort of things is how we influence and use this physical space. So I spent like about a decade going back and forth. I live in Mexico City, and I would fly up to South Texas. I started taking pictures with this Polaroid camera of my family, and then just sort of realizing I was losing that memory, that space that I had held so true, part of my identity. At the same time, I was going to places like Central America. I was looking at the extreme poverty and violence that was pushing people through my land. So coming through ranches around where I grew up, you would see migrants. I'd meet Honduran migrants in desperate situations, people that were fleeing tremendous violence. And so I went there to document that. I saw all kinds of horrific things and met really amazing people that were suffering from the circumstances of political violence, or in this case, this mother of 3 children who lost her husband, who was a political leader in her village. These kinds of stories I thought were separate. I always imagined that I'm working on a reportage piece as a photojournalist for The New Yorker, for National Geographic, for whatever magazine or publication I was working for in Central America, and then going to places like Ciudad Juarez in Texas, and going back and forth. And I started to realize that these things were actually united. They were together. They were the same narrative. I would see things like this young boy who had been killed by police in a shootout by extortionists. He was 10 years old. And then the same types of people that were fleeing violence were being confronted in Texas by people like this man who were armed heavily. And it was a sort of connection of violence that has just sort of perpetrated through that region for so many years. A lot of things that happen in Texas are in the cover of darkness. When I was a kid growing up, we would see things about migrants. We would sometimes be in contact with them. But the U.S. authorities always made an effort to essentially move people at night or put them into very obscure and closed-off areas like this. This is a ranch. We started seeing tons of migrants coming in from Central America, being stopped often by people from the border, often from people from that speak the language and all these kinds of things. And so there's this weird kind of dichotomy of people who live on both sides, and it's sort of like the employment and everything. And what the irony of all of this is that I, myself, sort of became a product of the border. I was the nephew of a coyote. I was the godson of a former Colombian lancero who fought with the Contras in Honduras to basically disrupt and create a lot of problems that exist now in that country. Other family members of mine were drug traffickers. Others are ICE agents currently. And now I'm a journalist that works there. So you can imagine Christmas can be pretty weird. This is a ranch in South Texas, and you see this on the left here. We have the backpacks of migrants, the wine bottles of rich politicians who go to hunt there, and the deer antlers that are left behind. And these are the bodies of migrants that were left in a mass grave. And so I'd be taking these pictures, and then I would end up with my uncle going to visit his father's grave after we pounded about 4 Miller Lights. And, it was just this weird sort of sacado de onda, where I'm like taking pictures of this horrific scene, and then I'm there with my family. I spent a long time, almost 7-8 years, working in Ciudad Juarez with young people, looking at the children of factory workers and how they were being used as cannon fodder in the drug war. I spent all of this time. I got very close to people like this man, Pollo, and his wife, who unfortunately passed away recently. And at the end of this experience, I felt like I had just a collection of photographs, which are important, and I believe in the power of photography, but I had this great emotional debt to the place. And so I started to experiment with other things. I had this, idea of doing installations. I started doing things like this, where I would make video stills of factory workers going to work, and then working with sculptures. And eventually I wrote a play that was based on this, and right now we're working on a screenplay for a film about these young people. with a film company in Mexico City. But at the end of that, I kept thinking, what am I doing here? And am I just adding to the narrative of this place? I'm showing this map very quickly because, the politics have driven this border thing, and it's been constantly said that this is for us, right? But you can tell we didn't want it, right? This is the votes for Beto. You can see how blue the border is. I started making landscapes of the Mexican-American War. And I started having this idea about the conversations that we have about the border and the idea of community and the separation of community. These are families in Tijuana having conversations with their family members and this separated by this physical fence. In fact, for me, I think that the border is more of a connecting force than a separating force. For us, it creates a unique experience from east to west that is defined by this physical space and defined by our shared history. I think it's important for us to remember that and to remember who these people are, the people who live in this community, who dominate this space, because up until now, we haven't really been represented politically. In fact, we have been marginalized, like in the case of this young boy who lives in Logan Park. Recently there was a white supremacist group that were trying to protest in this space. This is one of the oldest communities in San Diego. After the Mexican-American Wars, it's been there since the 1800s. It's my grandmother, trying to tie in more and more connectiveness into these communities. So that's it. That's me. And I will now invite Valentina to come up. Thank you.
Super. Hi. I'm here to present, thanks everybody for being here. I'm here to present a project on child migration experiences on the Americas. I am part of a team of 8 researchers, anthropologists, geographers, photographers, who've been working with migrant children across the continent for almost a decade. So we are coming from countries like Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, Brazil, and the US. And we've been working with children crossing the whole continent. And this project actually started 12 years ago when I met a group of kids who have had a lot of different experiences about migration, whether internal or international migration. And when I was working with these kids, Pifa and Mari were about to leave their hometown to cross the desert. And they were writing a play. And on this play, there was these 2 brother and sister who would cross the desert and meet a lot of animals who would inhabit the desert and talk to them. And it was an amazing play. The thing is that they never get actually the chance to finish it because Pifa and Maribel had actually to leave and cross the desert to be able to reunite with their father. But while they were on this journey, they were spotted by the Border Patrol. They had to hide. And Pifa was bitten by a scorpion, who was actually one of the main characters of the play he never finished writing. So this is actual life. He gets bitten by this scorpion and he falls unconscious. And the coyote leading the group, thinking or deciding that he was dead, forces all the group, including his mother, to leave and leave him on the desert. Fortunately, he woke up several minutes after this, and he managed to spot the group far away on the horizon, and he managed to run very fast and reach the group. Many months later, I met Bifa and Mari in the southern part of the US, where they were living with both his parents. And they told me about this experience. And they asked me to finish the play because they wanted other people, and especially their family, to know that they were well and what they had just experienced. I will never forget the look on the face of these two kids who at that time were 8 and 10 years old, going through an experience that we often see in the news, read in the novels. And that 12 years ago sparked on me a very, very important personal, academic, and professional compromise with these kids. So now we have created this project, and thanks to Nat Geo, we are able to put together the research of more than 10 years, of more than 8 researchers, to document the experiences and the knowledge of these kids who we often think as passive actors, helpless victims of reckless or abusive adults. And we often think of them as belonging to the realm of emotions and trauma. And what we want to stand for, and what we want to let the world know, is that children are fundamental constructors and shapers of mobility in the American continent. We now have more than 3 generations of kids who have grown without one or both their parents, children who are fleeing violence and unacceptable inequality, which is produced by regional and international economic and political decisions that all the governments in our continent are making. And we have this statement to show that children do not belong to the private realm. They are actually political subjects, and every decision, every policy that we enforce on migrant children, on the borders that put them at this high risk, is a decision that we are making on human rights. And it's a decision we are taking that will affect the limits of what we consider acceptable or unacceptable for human dignity. So we are working with children living as far as towns in the Andes in Ecuador, traveling many times alone, like more than 7,000 kilometers, traveling by land, by boat, by plane, being smuggled in many ways. We are working with children taking sanctuary along their mothers to resist deportation. We are working with children who are being deported and forced to repatriation because their family is being deported and they are being forced back to a place they don't know as home. They don't feel it's home. We are working with children traveling unaccompanied as young as 2, 4 years old, even months. And we really want to bring the importance of privileging children's testimonies, experiences, and knowledge. Again, not because they don't have a voice, and we will give them a voice. Not because we are enforcing trauma, not only because of that, because they are the generations that are going to define the way we think the world, and they are challenging us to redefine even the most basic narratives we have built on borders. And they are showing us, by their experiences, that the decisions they make to travel, as young as these kids, many times alone, many times with their father, their fathers and mothers, is not a reckless decision. It's being forced by conditions that concern us all. And they are asking us to think about borders, not as walls that will keep us apart, but as crucial opportunities to realize that we are all connected. Thank you very much. Now please welcome Erika to the stage.
Hi. I'm already crying. I cry a lot when I talk, and I'm already crying before I start. So I'm Erika, and we're going to go a bit more north with this story, just to give you a little bit about my passion. I'm really interested in, have spent my time learning from people that have close connections to the natural world. I see them as interpreters. Through their language, through their culture, through their rituals, they are the ones who are reflecting the environment, and for me, teaching me the things I need to learn to be more human. So I got lucky. I got a story for National Geographic to go to Quinnahock, Alaska. And actually, this is the writer, Anne's picture. I did not have the foresight to take a picture from the air. But this is what Quinnahock looks like. The village is there, and that body of water you're seeing is the Bering Sea. And Quinnahock is a Yupik village, and in Yupik, Quinnahock means New River Channel. And it was named that because at the time, when the elders were putting the first village down, they said it would move 5 times before it would be a permanent village. And right now, it's in its 3rd incarnation. This gives you just a bit more of an idea in terms of a map, and just to give you a little bit of an idea on what's going on climate-wise. So Quinnahock is just north of the Aleutians there, north of Bristol Bay. It's got close proximity to the Bering Sea. You're seeing rapid permafrost melt, and the shoreline sinking, and as the waters are rising, it's all of the shoreline on Alaska on the western side is really fragile. And here we are. This is called Nunalak. Nunalak is what the Yupik called the Old Village. This square used to be a lot bigger. Actually, the Old Village would have extended into the waterline that we see now. The Yupik have an oral tradition for this story over 500-600 years old. And it was most important in a time called the Little Ice Age. And for the Yupik, it was a time called the Bow and Arrow Wars, a war amongst the Yupik themselves when resources were scarce. And as the story goes, another village came and raided and killed everyone in this village, and nobody went back there since. This is kind of theoretically what it would have looked like. As they've begun to dig further, they realize that it goes much deeper, and that it's probably over 1,000 years old. But I want to bring you into this story through the person that I got connected to. And I'm going to introduce you to Mike. So Mike lives in Quinnahock, and one day he was walking out to the Bering Sea because he was going to take his life. And he stepped over one of the artifacts that had come out of the old village. And in one way, this is nothing new. Villagers have come across the artifacts for over 30 years. But he picked it up, and he said he heard his ancestors. And he said he heard that they needed to preserve this village and that the children would sing again and they would dance again because they haven't danced in 80 years. And he needed to go back and talk to the elders about that. And Warren is the man you see on my right, and that's his father, and he is the head of the village corporation. And he went back and spoke with Warren. And this idea to preserve this village had been in debate for quite a while. Half the village felt that we shouldn't touch the past, it needs to lay at rest, and other people were interested in preserving it. And when Mike came back with this story, Warren went and spoke to the elders. They agreed that they were going to preserve it or take as much part in it as they could, and Warren began applying for grants, and he got in touch with Rick Knecht, who is a well-known archaeologist in Alaska, and he's worked on a lot of other sensitive sites in the region. And so they've been partnering together for over 10 years now. And that's how I also got brought in, was to document this work between Rick and Warren, the site and the village. So as a storyteller, I was there to learn about what does the village mean today, the old village and the new village, and how is the village of today interpreting the old village. So Quinnahook itself has about 600 people, and it's about a mile long. And when I showed up, I didn't know anybody, and I would walk up and down this mile-long stretch, and I was very nervous, and I didn't know how to approach people, but at the same time, it was so obvious I was there because everyone else that's there lives there. So and this was the one house I kept coming back to, and I noticed the walrus tusks on the over the door, and so finally I got the courage to knock on the door and go inside. And I met these two women, Fanny and Emma. And instantly, I walked inside, and they kind of sat me on the floor and just started talking. And they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm just interested in learning about you, but learning about this old village. And Fanny brought this out, and she goes, "Oh, let me tell you." She goes, "This is a story knife." And that's what she has in her hand there. And she said, "They're finding lots of these at the site." And she goes, "But this story knife was given to me as a child." And she said, "In my culture, women are given a story knife, and this is how we tell a story."
Easier with the mic.
I would walk down the street back and forth a bit more, still nervous to meet people. And one day, Frances, the woman to my right here, or to my left here, she came up on an ATV and she had all these fishing poles in the back. And she looked at me and she asked me if I wanted to go fishing. And I would jump on the back and continue to go fishing with her every night for the next month. She would take me back to her house. She would show me how she'd prepare fish for the day, how she'd store it for the winter time. And then she would talk about the site. And she'd say, down there, all the archaeologists, they're finding all these fish bones because everything's so well preserved because of the permafrost. And she said, and they're asking about our fish bones today. And so she was relating that the work that they're doing with the fish is really important because it's related to the bones at the site, and it's telling them about the diet from the past and how the climate has been affected over the years and what's their diet like today. And so she was really proud to be a part of that work. And I met John Smith, and since the beginning, so the dig site, so you understand, is open 6 weeks of the year only in the summertime. And John Smith, from the beginning, has been maybe what you'd call an interpreter of the site, like one of the main elder interpreters of the site. And every day he'll go down to the site. And he's retired now, but he's a carver. So after his retirement, he's dedicated more time to carving. But ever since the site happened, he'd go down every day. He'd look at what artifacts were coming out. He'd go back to his workshop, and by the evening, he had replicated it. And he was literally saying that he's bringing his ancestors back to life, patterns they hadn't seen but maybe only heard about. He'd marvel at the precision of the tools that they must have had, things that he can't do today. And then you notice that a lot of the young people in the village would go and watch him and want to learn, and they got excited about carving again. And on top of that, people wanted to buy this artwork, and so it sort of stimulates some of the economy for especially some of the youth in the village. And this would be, honestly, a typical day at the dig site. So I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a scientist, but the archaeologists that are there, and most of them are volunteer, there's only a couple that are under the grant work, and they say this is a dream, where they're coming up with like 50 artifacts a day, or literally coming out of the ground like this. This was in situ. I didn't really set it up. This was exactly kind of how things were working. But what's really interesting is how much the archaeologists are learning about how to challenge their own perceptions and challenge their own knowledge of what they know and what they've learned in their field work. Because one day, this came out, and I was there, and everyone's like, oh, look at the whale. By the way, this is an ulak. It's a woman's knife. And the handle there, everyone's like, look at the whale in the handle, and everyone was so excited. And in the evening, they brought it back to the village, back to Quinnahock, and the first elder that came in and said, oh, look at the seal. And, and so it reminded instantly of this duality that's ever present in the Yupik culture, and that you should always question what you're seeing, because maybe that's just one side of your perception, and you should always question that. And Rick especially always challenges the people working with him. It's another ulak candle. I just want to give you some idea of the gems and the beauties that are coming out of the ground. Harpoon toggle. This was all found together in a cache. Game pieces, the little pieces you're seeing there. And this is one of the modern day pieces made by John. It's a needle case holder that was found at the site, and he replicated it. And I actually got to take this one home, so. But I'm going to end up here because this is sort of the beginning. What Mike heard is that it was about the children. It's about the next generation. That this preservation of this site is really about remembering. About remembering and about hearing again. So I wanted to learn about the site from the children. What did it mean to them? One thing I saw from the archaeology end is that the children are involved in a daily level of learning preservation. So one important thing is all the artifacts will remain in the village. They've actually built a cultural center, which will act as a preservation lab and a museum. And so the children are learning preservation work through the archaeologist. They're learning the science behind looking through the different materials and the dirt. But at the same time, they're remembering that this is them. It's always been in their heart. It is who they are, and they should be proud of it. And now they've got a whole new world to represent this world in, and they're the bearers of that. And I got the opportunity to go back with National Geographic Photo Camp. I think you saw that in the beginning video when it started. And I was really excited that they went behind it. And the first thing I saw is the children represented themselves through dancing. This dance they hadn't done in 80 years. This is Michael, and he's showing us a seal hunting dance. And the idea of the photo camp is to understand their village through their eyes and their relationship to the site. This is a lot of the children in the group. The first thing they did was dance to introduce themselves. And everything you're going to see from here on out is their vision. They showed me their elders, their ability to heal, their recreations of their histories, of their stories, their daily life, their identity, their relatives, their livelihood, their mysteries, who they are as Americans, and how they identify the land that they live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika. I want to actually start by asking you a question about your field research there. Years ago, I was doing research in Canada looking at patterns of immigration from West Indian immigrants and what the relationship was between West Indian immigrants and First Nations people. And one of the things that struck me was the continuity of storytelling. And I remember speaking to a First Nations person, and they said, the way we relate to this environment is through stories, right? There's an important book that said, if this is your land, where are your stories? And it seems to me that the threat, the natural threat of climate change and all of that is threatening the physical space. But it's interesting that your research suggests that that physical space is also tied to that oral culture and that communal space. I mean, did you get a chance to talk to them much about the connections between what they're losing in terms of the natural space and how?
Absolutely. And it seems quite twofold. From one perspective, the thing they're saying is that we've always, especially because they were Arctic people, they've always considered themselves nomadic. They were always moving. So they say this change, we've always been adaptable. I hear this a lot in Arctic culture in general, is that we have always migrated, we've always moved, and so we've adapted and changed as the landscape around us has changed. Actually, a lot of these cultures, their language defines this, like what they, I lived in the Arctic, in Scandinavian Arctic, and one really important lesson for me was the word called monoron dahpe, I live here. And what does that mean? It means I live here for a short time until it doesn't sustain me anymore, until I move somewhere else. So even their relationship with landscape, in one way, this isn't so strange for them. Are they losing things? It can explain. What I say is I think they're quite adaptable, and this doesn't seem to be so out of their wheelhouse of understanding. I think it's the rapid change that's interesting for them.
Okay. Should I invite the other panelists up? Where are they? Hello?
Come on, you guys.
Here you are. Okay.
Hey, buddy.
So I'm actually going to stand.
Yeah.
Please,
Okay.
please, have a seat. So I want to thank all of you for your presentations, and in a way, sort of building on Erika's presentation, my role here is to interpret and to ask questions. And I think one of the things that was striking about all of your presentations in different ways was the importance of bearing witness and the way, whether it's through the photographic lens, through storytelling that builds on legacy, and then the role of storytelling for children. It seems to me that there's so many ways that bearing witness must come to the fore of all of these conversations. And I wanted to ask you all to reflect a little bit based on your individual projects on what that phrase means to you, what it means particularly from the vantage point of children. Photography is one way indeed that we can bear witness to what history has given us, and certainly storytelling. So would you like to begin?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important of the idea of seeing children as fundamental, children as a fundamental knowledge of migration and place and belonging and memory. And actually it is photography and video and media like that allows children self-representation. It is very important when you work with them that you realize that you have to step back in a way that you are more like you build a dialogue and not impose your voice and your perspective on them. And that's why photography and these kind of projects that involve media are so important.
Okay. Yeah, I think the word bearing witness is usually associated with journalism with a capital J, especially in photography, and there's a lot of conversations right now as to what that means and the other and where your place is, and being a white man, what does that mean if you're working in these spaces? All I know is that I feel that being a photographer has really taught me a lot about how to be with other people, how to listen. I think most importantly, you can't make a good photograph without listening to people. And that's one of the things that I love so much. Erika and I have both done photo camps, and I did one in Ciudad Juarez with students there. And the thing that's great about photo camp and photography in general is that it really teaches you to empathize and to look, by looking at someone else, you actually sort of reflecting on your own experience and like trying to, I guess in a way, learn empathy. And I think that we have a privilege as storytellers that we are constantly able to listen to other people's perspective firsthand, and that's a really unique experience that not everybody gets an opportunity to have. So it's nice to be able to share it in things like photo camp and that kind of stuff. But even with the work that we do, if we can, try to get it out as much as possible.
For me, I would say that the term bearing witness would reflect in sort of my experience by, it's the greatest, sort of most visceral tool we have for learning. And so I do this because when I actually get to go and see and to feel, then I'm the one that has to change. It doesn't mean that my work will change anyone else or anything else, but I'm the one that has to change. And every experience will change you from the smallest to the largest. And so that's what it means for me.
Okay. Can I ask, I guess, another question? My questions are going to be for the whole group, because I think this session, really folds each presentation one into the other. I think one of the most important things that I heard you talking about was thinking, Valentina, about kids as agents, as they're active participants in this narrative. We typically think about children as, sort of, as you said, passive, uninvolved, but so much of their storytelling is about making sense of the world around them. And so clearly, I think for each one of you in your work, storytelling is a vital part of that. And it seems to me that regardless of where you are, right, there's a basic humanity that can be communicated or interpreted through the craft of storytelling. So I'd actually like each of you to reflect on why or how your role as storytellers is so important at this historical moment. I want to stress this historical moment right now. It's a big question, but
Yeah, it's a big question.
I only ask one question.
And I think the answer for me was given by the children themselves. Storytelling is very important right now because storytelling is a collective experience and it's a fluid experience. So storytelling will allow us to challenge, to re-question, to remap everything that we think is true, everything we have built and might not be working. And the idea that storytelling is a collective product is fundamental, because in that way we can recognize different voices, different experiences, and give them the place they deserve. In all these power narratives where people get to tell stories that get too much audience, we really need to redefine the use and the potential and the power of storytelling.
Thank you.
Do you want to go?
Do you want to go? Go.
Sure.
You go.
Well, actually, I'm going to take one of your ideas. But no.
Okay, I'm going to go.
Yeah, go. No, Erika, I don't know. We have all these conversations. We get really heady, and she said something that I really liked about storytelling being this like really ancient human form.
Oh, you took mine.
Yeah,
No,
but I'm not gonna go there. What I'm gonna say is,
But we're all tapping into it. It's the same thing she said with different words,
Totally.
right? It is a collective, ancient form. Sorry.
No, it's your idea. But the thing is that I'll say, so this is a conversation we had when we were in Moldova doing a photo camp, and we were like, I don't know, I think we're all both like kind of in this existential crisis of, I've covered a lot of stories about immigration. I grew up, my whole dad's side of the family is Hispanic, and they're like extremely racist. And you would think that they would be able to identify with these stories of immigration and stuff, but they just don't. And I've tried, you think that if you can change anybody's mind, it would be like your own father. And it's just not that easy. I think that it's important for us. That's why I'm so interested in events like this and talking to younger people, because we're just, I would say, I'm gonna throw myself in that camp. We're a little bit more open. But I do think for that same reason, though, it's like, sort of like the collectiveness of stories, and that's why it's important for so many of us to be doing that. And right now, we're bombarded with information, but it's still driven by, forces of consumerism, forces of, whatever, political will, and that's why I think we have to constantly, as storytellers, like be confronted with these hard questions, like what are we doing now, and where are we in the space? And I feel like, for me personally, that was deciding, for example, in the case of work on Juarez, it was, I can't tell all these stories because I'm literally putting people's lives in danger. So I started writing fiction, so.
And just to follow up on both of that, I personally look at storytelling as the most ancient form of healing. It's what the shaman was doing, and without the collective, so the shaman was maybe regarded as the healer, but it was the collective story, right? So I look at it as a real honor, and that's what I think it is.
So I want to follow that up, which is my own sort of selfish interest, and the reason I said yes to Kenny when he asked me to do this. I feel like this is, on the one hand, completely outside of my wheelhouse, and on the other hand, absolutely central, in the sense as someone who thinks about art as an integral part of how a culture understands itself and how that culture is represented. And I think people can tend to think of National Geographic as sort of, journalism. It gives facts, it gives statistics, it gives great pictures that you can see as evidence. And I think one of the interesting things about all of your presentations today is that you are doing this journalism that is about facts, but then translating it into artistic projects, right? Whether it's through, these beautiful sort of short montages or installations, or in your case, these important legacies through maintaining oral culture, dance, performance. Do you consider yourself artists in that traditional sense of the word? Or do you think first about sort of trying to get the information, the data, the facts, and then trying to translate it into a form that can communicate some of what the importance of this work is about?
Well, I definitely consider the children as natural artists, definitely. I don't know about myself. I think my role would be, it is more useful, like in other places, like envisioning these projects that will help them show this and actually show these narratives in a way that you don't have to privilege adult languages. Like in the context of the children with whom I work, which many of them are indigenous, many of them, of course, are migrants, it is very important that you don't privilege one specific language. In this case, Spanish, for example, in the case of Mexico, Portuguese in the case of Brazil, because many of them speak other languages, indigenous languages. So also, many of them don't know how to write and read. So you have to be very careful not to privilege those languages when you are working with them. So art is the perfect language to not impose the terms on which you want the narrative to be created and give them different tools to play, to experiment, and to express themselves. So, yeah.
I mean, for myself, I started strictly as a photojournalist. That was my goal, and I left, sort of feeling unsatisfied with the ability of that language to do everything that I wanted to do. I still believe photojournalism has an important role in society, and I'm 100% an active participant in photojournalism still to this day. But the work that I'm most interested in presenting, I think, fits better in different spaces. I feel like with narrative journalism, we're constantly restricted by the space and the time and the news cycle, which is a huge issue if you're trying to, like if we do long investigative projects, and where, I've been covering these issues on the border for my whole life, basically, and I don't, it's like right now I'm not with the caravan, but it's, I don't know, there's like that whole like, well, why aren't you there? You know, this kind of thing. I don't want to be restricted by that sort of thing. And I feel like that's a problem because we're not contextualizing anything. Like we're repeating the same, you know, revisionist narratives over and over and over again because we have this concept that in journalism that there's a lot of information that's already understood, but that's not true. What's understood is a revisionist narrative. What needs to be retaught is history. So that, for me, is an important part of my process. And I think that, you know, in fiction and film and making music videos, collaborating with other types of artists, making installations, that I feel like that's a fun space to experiment with that sort of approach.
Okay. I'm going to come back and ask you to talk a little bit more about that, but I would like to hear what Erika has.
So just to go off of what Valentina said, that I see art exactly as that. It's the space where we communicate on many different levels, where there's new places to find language, to find communication. So I just try as hard as possible to be in that realm as much as I can, to really hear.
I want to, piggyback on what you just said, because space, so much of all of this talk about migration and borders and walls is about who controls space, who belongs to this space versus that space. And the word belong is an interesting, again, someone who writes about migration, I tend to chop up the word and said, you know, what does it mean to belong in a space? Like, some of it has to do with how long have you been here, right? And if that's the case, if you pose that question to Americans, it's a different kind of question. Automatically, the narrative has to change, right? Because most of us are pretty damn new here, right? Yeah. And so when we think about space in that way, I think all of your work is about sort of reimagining these spaces. I think what I was most struck by with the montage that you did is that I imagine that migratory space in the desert is a terrifying space for a child. But when you take it and craft it into this other narrative, even, you know, there was a kind of fear in my heart when I heard that he got bit by a scorpion, right? The space of that memory is also jarring. So there's a way that I think all of your work is about recrafting how we think about space, right? Where do you imagine your work 3 years from now in intervening in how we think, talk, and remember space on the whole as part of this conversation? Again, I'm sorry for the big question, but your work raises big questions to me, right? Space is critical. Sweat. So I'm going to start with, since we've been going in this direction, I'm going to start with Erika and go back in the other direction.
Oh, so to be honest, I don't know if it's a question I need 3 years to think about, really. But I could imagine that, right, I think, okay, so for me to be the most thing I can think of, that would be like the most intuitive, is that's what I'm hopeful for. Mm-hmm. I'm hopeful to find that space. I don't know what it is yet, but it's a space where I think, I think it's a space we don't, maybe it's just about to open up. It's a space maybe we don't have just yet. Maybe it's a space, right? Or maybe we just haven't, we're all kind of beginning to get there.
Okay, yet to be determined, right? It's in process, okay?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think right now a lot of, I'd say our generation of storytellers seems to be like we're reaching this, like we're all kind of like clawing at something. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because we all have that same sort of maybe self-doubt or sort of grasping to do something more, because we've seen sort of the restrictions of what we've been able to do with our work, and confronted repeatedly with really tough issues that are continuously used as political projects against these people that we care so much about, especially in the case of migrants who are so vulnerable, and you listen to their stories and you're just like, you feel at a loss, and that impotence can be really heartbreaking. But I think for me, I've been sort of feeling a little mischievous And so when I got this grant with National Geographic to do this sort of, I was actually surprised because it was kind of like, this is like super personal and weird and out there. But they were excellent and giving me a ton of freedom, which is amazing. And right now, what I want to sort of start connecting the dots. I mean, it's funny because I had all this doubt about the project, and then when I got into the field and started making portraits, I was like, I'm doing this thing about la identidad fronteriza and like border people and all this stuff, and everybody's like, oh yeah, okay, cool, yeah, I'll sit down for your portrait, nobody, it's like they got it. But then when I would explain it to people like in Mexico City or even, in DC or whatever, I don't really get what you're doing, And I think that's cool, actually, because I'm like, you know what, we know what's going on. So
that's what matters.
Yeah, and so I feel like I'm doing like a little bit of a subversive thing. I want to work, like I've been working with this DJ, cumbia DJ, and we've been trying to do like some events and some music videos and stuff together to just and maybe some products and messing around to be like, you know what, we have an identity and a shared cultural history that needs to be connected, because if we don't, like we're about to lose like something really great. I mean, our economy in South Texas relies on Mexico. Like we have to have that connection, and if we continue to with this rhetoric, it's going to be like Brexit,
Very quickly.
Well, I definitely see myself still working with kids. And with creative and also ethically and politically committed projects. And I envision this commitment of showing how the different ways in which children experience space. When you interview a kid coming from Brazil, the way he or she experiences the transit, migration, even when he comes from Guatemala and you interview him, he thinks that after Chiapas, the border with the US is just right there. And they don't have this idea of how long 7,000 kilometers mean. So we definitely have to rebuild like the global map in order to understand what they are going through. And also there's all this architecture and institutional geography that is being built around child migration. There are all these detention centers, officials that detain children, all these procedures, all these agreements, all this apparatus, physical, legal, political apparatus that is being built on child migration. And that is also one way they are reshaping the geography and the space in the American continent.
I'd like to thank each one of you and thank the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you.